And so you know that in every case of healing, your first step is the realization of God as constituting all being, and working along that line until you have actually an inner assurance that God is. Then, that you impersonalize the evil, the error, the appearance, whatever its name or nature, by consciously knowing that this is no part of a person, that all evil is impersonal. That's why in the beginning it was called devil, the evil one or the one evil, meaning an impersonal source of evil. And the very moment that you separate it from the individual by realizing, no, this is devil, but not in the sense that, oh, this is devil, now we're going to get God to fight him, but this is devil meaning this is the arm of flesh or nothingness, or this is carnal mind, or this is mortal mind. In any event, the evil must be impersonalized. That means it must be taken from person. It must be seen that this evil is not in, of, or through person. It is not appearing as person. It is something separate and apart from person, for it is impersonal evil. Then, because of the nature of God as omnipotence, it must be the arm of flesh or nothingness. In other words, we had the example of the master being faced with the devil and 3 temptations. And we discovered that when he said no to each one, that was the end of the devil. The devil had no more power. We don't hear of the devil after that, because the devil did nothing. In other words, there was no power to the devil. There would have been, had there been an acceptance of the temptation. There would have been power, but it wouldn't have been the devil's power. It would have been the power through acceptance of the temptation or suggestion. So that if you are presented with a claim of your own or another's and regard it as a temptation and then accept it, then you are left with it. You're hooked. But if you can recognize instantly, this is claim, this is temptation, this is an appearance, this is carnal mind or devil presenting itself to me, and I can reject it because it is not of God. There it is. It is not of God. There you must be completely free of all orthodox teachings, because they would convince you that God is responsible for the evils of the world. In other words, when your child is sick or your child dies, the minister says, of course, God called this dear one home. God must have been responsible for that case of polio. God must have been responsible for these horrible cancers, because the funeral service says God has willed it so, and God has called this one home. That shouldn't even be used in vaudeville. God hath no pleasure in your dying, and the Scripture says so. God is of too pure eyes to behold iniquity, and Scripture says so. And the Master says, I am come to do the will of my Father. What is the will of my Father? Heal the sick, raise the dead. Then your Father can't be responsible for sickness or death, or the Master could not have thwarted the Father's purpose. So any time that you are tempted to go back to your theology and believe maybe God had something to do with this sin or this disease or this poverty, or maybe God is punishing my sins, tear up your memories. There is no such God. There never was. That was a paganistic concept of the early Hebrews. It should have been thrown out when the Master came to reveal that neither do I condemn thee. And he did nothing of himself, though he was saying virtually, neither does the Father condemn you. Neither does the Father condemn you. And never forget that. No. And though your sins be scarlet, you'll be white as snow. Turn ye and live. God has no pleasure in your dying. And so don't believe for a moment that sin, disease, or death have anything whatsoever to do with God. And if they don't have to do with God, God didn't create them. And if God didn't create them, they can have no existence apart from the mind that is believing in two powers. And that narrows it down to your mind. Do you believe in this universal teaching of two powers, or have you come to an agreement that God is infinite and omnipotent? Now, for the benefit of those who have already had a measure of success in healing work, let me take you another step. And this is one case where you won't find authority for this anywhere on earth. And so you'll have to be your own authority and prove its rightness. Every problem that touches an individual, every problem of every nature, of any nature, regardless of who they may be, what their religion is or what it isn't, every problem of life is a form of mental malpractice. It is not directed at you by anyone, so please don't hold anyone in condemnation and don't look around at your neighbor. They are not malpracticing you, nor is your mother-in-law. There is a universal malpractice which is the direct result of this belief in two powers. It is entirely universal, but it becomes individual when we accept it, or when we accept ourselves as instruments for its activity. For instance, sometimes it is believed that if someone hates you or dislikes you or mistrusts you, all of these are forms of malpractice. Someone may even be directing evil thoughts at you. Well, now let us take that at its present basis of human understanding. Ever since the introduction of metaphysics into the world, there has been a belief that thought is power. And it has been believed that a good thought is good power and bad thought is bad power. Well, wherever there's a belief in two powers, of course, this undoubtedly operates. As a matter of fact, as we go back into the primitive teachings, that is, the teachings of the primitive peoples, we find that ages before the metaphysical age, they knew the power of thought, and they knew how to direct good thought, and they knew how to direct evil thought. They could heal and they could kill. and some still do, all with the power of thought. Now, when metaphysics came into the world, it was almost as a new discovery, because those concerned with the early days of metaphysics had no knowledge whatsoever of these ancient primitive peoples and their teachings and practices. And so it was presented to the world as a new discovery that thought is power, and that if you hold a good thought, you can heal people. And then, as some of you know, Mrs. Eddy discovered that some of her students were holding bad thoughts and harming their patients. And she exposed that and showed her students of those days how to prevent its occurrence. However, as the metaphysical world has moved on, the type of people who have been attracted by Christian Science, by unity, by new thought, have not been evil people. They have not been the type of people who wanted to use thought for any evil purpose. And so we have had very little in the literature of metaphysics concerning this use of thought for evil purposes. It really took a minister to bring it to light. One who has written a book full of his ignorance of the subject, loaded full, in which he shows some experiments in which good thought, or what he called good prayer, made plants grow faster than their natural growth would be. But I suppose Adam and Eve came to life, and so he had to discover what bad thought would do. And so he taught some people bad thoughts and had them experiment, and found that the plants would wither and die. And so this man, with no training on the subject, says that prayer, correctly understood, can destroy. Don't you ever believe it? Prayer can't. Prayer is your relationship with God. Prayer is the only access we have to God. Prayer is our only means of communion with God. And anyone who says that that can be destructive has never studied the works of Jesus Christ. For he came to this world not to destroy, but to heal, to raise from the dead. It is true, however, that human thought, not prayer, human thought of a wrong nature can be destructive. Not quite as destructive as they would have you believe, but it can be destructive, more especially if an individual, like these ancient primitives, concentrate their mental powers to the point of wanting to destroy. You can't harm anyone with a wrong thought. But if you ever sat down to really practice it, you would find that with the power of wrong thinking, you could destroy. But the only thing that you must be warned about is don't try it on a true student, for it may end in your death. For what you believe becomes the belief unto you, and its penalty. You see, any individual who knows and lives and moves and has his being in the realization of God's presence as omnipotence is living in one power, and there is no secondary power that can touch him. Whether it is a mental projection or whether it is a germ, whether it is an hereditary condition, whether it is infectious or contagious, whether it is age or whatnot, rest assured no individual can be malpracticed who is living in the life of oneness. One power, one law, one being, one cause. Then all of the evils can hit up against your door, and the 91st Psalm rightly says, 1,000 may fall at your left and 10,000 at your right, it will not come nigh you. Not only that, but it will backfire to the one that sent it. That is really the secret of the story of Sapphira. The moment you withhold from God, the moment you withhold truth or from truth, you set up a reaction within yourself, and what the penalty is dependent on the circumstances of the moment. In their case, it was death. In this same way, all evil, whether it appears as lack or limitation, whether it appears as destructive weather, whether it appears as infection or contagion or even epidemic, all of this is a malpractice. Only it isn't directed thought from an individual. It is the universal malpractice which is made up of the belief of two powers, and your protection is living in one power, agreeing that anything other than the presence of God is non-power. This is your protection, and none of these evils can enter to defile or make a lie within you. Also, this is your healing power, to understand that you are not dealing with disease or sin, you are not dealing with floods, you're not dealing with tidal waves or typhoons. You are dealing with a universal malpractice made up of the belief in two powers, and watch how the error begins to subside and finally dissolves. That water that you see on the desert isn't water. It's another malpractice. It's making you see something that doesn't exist. We use another word for it, hypnotism, suggestion. It only means throwing a picture at you and making you see it erroneously. Only, whereas in some metaphysical teachings you have been made to fear people and their malpractice, now release yourself from that nonsense. It really makes no difference if there are people malpracticing. They are not the malpractitioner, and you need fear nothing from them. They are themselves victims of malpractice, of this universal belief in two powers. And you can deprive them of that power just as you can deprive a hypnotist of his power. That experiment has been tried over and over and over and over again. A hypnotist trying to hypnotize someone, or even a whole group, where there was one individual there who knew the one power. They can't get by with it. It's an impossibility. You stop them cold the minute you know that the human mind, that is, the belief in two powers, isn't power. The minute you know that this belief that the mind is power is just the arm of flesh or nothingness. The mind is an avenue of awareness. It's not a power. It can't do anything or be anything except be aware, except on the level where it is accepted as a power. Now, I don't know if I've told you the experiment, no, not the experiment, the experience of the reporter in London recently who, realizing that the winter season was coming on and wondering what could be done about colds, went to a noted doctor and said, now with this season coming on, is there any way known that we can wipe out colds or reduce them? And more especially, is it true that these shots that they give for colds, is it true that it reduces colds or removes them? And the doctor said, indeed, yes. To get these shots, we have found, will reduce colds about 1/3. In other words, instead of 3 colds, there will only be 2. And if you get 3 colds in the winter, the probabilities are that you will only have 2. Oh, well, then he said, that's wonderful, even to reduce it by 1/3. Shouldn't we all recommend then that we get shots? No, he said, strangely enough, we find that if you get shots of pure water, it also reduces colds by 1/3. And the reporter wrote this for his paper. And so it is, you see, a belief in those shots would operate on the level where the belief is. Now, if you can accept God as the creative, maintaining, and sustaining principle of life, if you can accept the fact that this is not an accidental universe, this is a God-created one, then you must be able to accept the fact that negative power, evil power, cannot have any existence outside of the mind that believes in it. Now, because the mind that believes in it is the universal mind, every one of us believes in it, because that is the mind of every one of us. Therefore, it is only in proportion as we begin individually to live and move and have our being in the realization of God, and then realize all else is nothing but this mental malpractice, this belief in 2 powers. And instead of treating a claim as a claim, instead of treating disease as disease, sin as sin, lack as lack, treat it all as malpractice, a belief in 2 powers. And instead of treating it as malpractice and then saying, oh, but I must protect myself from malpractice, realize the nature of malpractice is the activity of the human mind and therefore nothingness. We, in our advanced work, have another term which is equally effective in our healing work. When faced with any problem, we recognize it as Antichrist. In other words, this isn't aimed at me, this is aimed at the Christ of me. In other words, nobody dislikes me enough to want to make me sick or die, but this universal malpractice would love, just love, if it had intelligence enough, to wipe out Christhood. That's why the Master could reveal that throughout all time Christ has always been crucified. As a matter of fact, the scrolls now reveal that Jesus Christ was not the original Savior who was crucified, but that it was another man 100 years before who was crucified also by the order of the church, and for the same reason. In other words, Christ was crucified wherever it raised its head. Christ always will be crucified wherever it raised its head, as long as there is a universal belief in 2 powers. And it will be not a Hebrew church that will crucify it, nor Rome that will crucify it, nor will it be a nation or a race that will crucify it. It is the universal belief in two powers is the Antichrist to you and to me. And therefore, when something aims itself at us like a calendar on the wall and says, you're past 80 years and 10, just look at it and say, Antichrist. You haven't any more power hanging on that wall. Can you imagine the power of a calendar on that wall? And it frightens every one of us, doesn't it? It's even got the government giving us money because of a calendar, because of what we have accepted as the belief about the calendar. Now let us understand this then. It really makes no difference whether it's a simple cold, or whether it's Asiatic flu, or whether it's an epidemic of polio or an epidemic of cancer. Please try to remember this, that you're not dealing with names. You are dealing not with effects. You are dealing with the only cause of discord that has ever existed in the world. And that's this hypnotism that comes out of the belief of two powers. And whether you want to call it hypnotism or general belief, whether you want to call it Antichrist, whether you want to call it malpractice, regardless of what you want to call it, as long as you impersonalize it, and as long as you recognize, because of the nature of God, it must be impotent, you are free, or you're on your way to freedom. And you will attain your complete freedom in proportion to your ability to impersonalize every phase of error and then negate it by resting in the Word, nothingizing it, resting in the Word. Don't go out there to battle that enemy that's stronger than you are. You'll be overcome by your belief that it is power. And every attempt you make makes it more so. Very, very seldom do I ever call on a patient. Rarely. Really. So rarely that I can't even remember the last time. Why? Get the water off the road? It wasn't there to begin with. I don't have to go there to get it off the road. It wasn't there to begin with. A power to be fought? It wasn't there to begin with. And my running around would merely represent my own fear. Therefore, the safest thing for me to do is stay right at home and realize this nothingness. Try to see this. This is an awfully important night in my life, because I'm showing you in just a little while the whole revelation of 30 years of actual work. And the mere fact that you are here, and that hundreds more will be in Los Angeles, and that hundreds more were with us in England, is proof that you've already witnessed fruitage from these principles. The fact that I've been going on 30 years proves the fruitage of this. Therefore, accept it, put it into practice, and then see for yourself. If you can't prove it, that's another thing. But try it. Work with it. Study it. Until you can see that evil isn't evil, it's Antichrist. And Antichrist isn't a power. Antichrist must be recognized as a nothingness. a nothingness that would, if it could, destroy spiritual existence. But can you imagine immortality being destroyed? Can you imagine eternality being destroyed? Can you imagine omnipotence having an opponent? And you can't. Therefore, you have every right, when you translate sin, disease, death, lack of limitation into such words as, oh, this is malpractice, belief in two powers, or this is Antichrist, belief in two powers, or this is a universal hypnotism, belief in two powers. You have every right to turn right over and go to sleep, instead of sitting up to fear it and fight it and protect yourself from it when there isn't any it. It hasn't been easy to work up through all of the orthodox faith that we were told to have, that God would do something. I have been asked the question, if there is a God, where was he with those 6 million Hebrews who died in furnaces? Or didn't he like Hebrews? But somebody else says, if there's a God, where was he when 500,000 people were killed in 2 nights in Japan? Didn't he like Japanese? Where was God when Berlin and Leipzig and Dresden were wiped out? Didn't he like Germans? Where was he in the Blitz in England? Didn't he like the English? You know, when you hear these questions for a while, you do ask yourself, is there anybody God likes and protects? Is there anybody's faith that's worthwhile? Doesn't he like these Hindus in India, starving down there, disease? Has he got anything? No. And what about their faith? They have more faith probably than anybody else in the world. Where is it? Oh, we say it's not a true faith. Well, just count up these Christian countries with their true faith since 1914. And let's get some answers to that. And you will find then that there is no use worrying about faith, and there's no use worrying about what God is going to do for you. God is doing it, and it's up to you to know that there is no power to thwart God's doing it. Only then do you honor God. Only then do you love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. You know, for more years than I care to tell you about, that thought plagued at me, how can I love God? I don't have a trace of feeling in my soul, in my mind, or in my heart for God, and I don't know how to love God. And it was only after I realized that God is not responsible in any way, shape, manner at all. There isn't anything God can do about our false beliefs. God's work is done. And when I saw that the realization of the impotence of these so-called evil powers was the answer, then I could love God. Now I can love God with all my heart, with all my soul. That's why God is on every line of every book of the infinite way. Now I can love God with all my heart, with all my soul, because I know God is maintaining and sustaining His universe, and it isn't going to be long until heaven is established on earth. Because once it is recognized that the so-called powers of this world aren't powers, and there's no use looking for powers to overcome them, what we need is non-powers, so as to let these so-called powers dissolve. If you have followed the history of the world as I have, and followed it from bows and arrows all the way up to atomic bombs, you will really know why it's futile to look for more powers in this world. And then if you follow the religions as I have, for dozens of centuries and watched them trying to bring God powers to establish peace on earth and health on earth, you'll soon get weary of looking for God powers, and you look in another direction, and that's what I did. Look in another direction. Stop looking for God powers. They're there, and they're operative. But what is separating me from that God power? And the Master gave me the first clue. If you abide in the Word and let the Word abide in you, you will bear fruit richly. If you do not abide in the Word and you do not let the Word abide in you, you'll be as a branch of a tree that is cut off and withereth. So it has nothing to do with God, it has to do with you. Do you abide in the Word? Now, what is the Word? Blaming God for the deaths in our family? That's not abiding in the Word. For I have come to give life eternal, not death. To know Him aright is life eternal. Where do you get sin, disease, and death from that? Therefore, instead of looking for a God power, let God alone and let Him do His work. Not that you could interfere with it, but be satisfied that that's not the direction to look. Don't look for power. Look to that which reveals to you God's omnipotence. That which reveals to you that not in heaven, not on earth, and not in the hells below is there a power that can operate in the consciousness of an individual who is abiding in God's grace. Not by doing God a favor, but by acknowledging Him in all thy ways. Thou wilt keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on thee. Lean not unto thine own understanding, acknowledge Him in all thy ways. He will give thee peace. He that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High, none of these things shall come nigh his dwelling place. Abide in the Word, let the Word abide in you, and you will bear fruit richly. So it has been revealed to me over the years through the Master that it isn't a going to God for more power that we need. It is a recognition of this great truth. What did hinder you? There are no material or mental powers that can operate in the consciousness of an individual who lives in the realization that thy grace is my sufficiency, for there is only one power. And this belief in two powers, which constitutes the carnal mind, is the temporal power. Certainly it operates as mental power and physical power as long as the belief in two powers exists. Once you come even in a measure to the realization of God, no good powers, no bad powers, only God, and only God powers. And this universal belief of two powers operating as a universal mesmerism, a universal hypnotism, a universal malpractice, an antichrist, nothingness, the arm of flesh. Then gradually do you become free. And then you'll wonder to yourself, did God do something for me today that God wasn't doing? No, God was doing it, only now you have removed from you the barrier. And so I come to a final point. There is a barrier in human consciousness which separates it from God's grace. That barrier is a universal belief in two powers, good and evil. In proportion as you overcome that within yourself, you are removing the barrier. Then, as I explained to you about the clouds, if there are clouds hiding the sun from us, in proportion as those clouds are dissolved, the sun will reveal itself as having been there all the time. So you will find that the good that comes into your experience today, the healing that comes into your experience, was there all the time, awaiting the removal of the barrier which is your belief, the universal belief which you've accepted in a power of good and a power of evil. And then beginning to fear disease, fear old age, fear death, fear lack and limitation, instead of realizing no two powers, not even one power, just God, just God. If I make it seem simple, don't believe me. Only one reason that I can state it to you this way: 30 years of practice. Proof. You won't need 30 years because I am giving you this principle, not only in speech, but in a dozen different ways or dozens of different ways in the writings, and you can study and practice and begin to accomplish quickly. Remember, there's no such thing as time. No such thing, just as there is no degree of evil. There's absolutely no difference between one disease and another. There's no difference between one sin and another. Therefore, time is not an element. It is only a matter of realizing that the water on the desert isn't water, it's mirage. That disease isn't disease, lack isn't lack, limitation isn't limitation, hate isn't hate, hypnotism isn't hypnotism. All of this is mirage. Rest in this word and don't go out and fight the enemy. You know, it just seems kind of sacrilegious to end 1959 without just this way. Yet there isn't anything I can add to it. And there's only one hope that I'm entitled to, and that is, before another year's around, that you will have proved this so conclusively that it will have rewarded you for the time, the effort, and the expense of coming here. Because you have given it your time, you have given it effort and devotion, and most of you have spent quite a bit of money to get here. And the only way that this can justify itself is in its fruitage in your experience. In offering it to you, it is without any question of its truth or efficacy, but it is with the caution that the fruitage of it is in proportion to your devotion to it. In other words, the bread that you cast on the waters is the only bread that can come back to you. The effort that you make is the only reward that can come to you. We as teachers are like way showers. We're bridges, we're temporary helps, whether as persons or as books. It is you who have to walk on the waters yourself eventually. You who will have to walk into heaven alone. And I think of this often. We came into this world alone, and it must have been a strange experience. And as we make our transition from it, we'll do it alone. We'll be on our own every step of the way. So it is with our spiritual teaching. You can't get to heaven by virtue of having a husband or wife or parent or child or teacher or teaching. You will make your demonstration of heaven on earth all alone. It is for this reason that I discourage discussions of truth or the exchange of ideas, because they're all worthless. The only thing that's worth anything is truth itself entertained in your consciousness. What somebody else's opinion is, how right or wrong someone else may think you are, has nothing whatsoever to do with it, and it won't help you. Even if they agree that you're right, it won't help you. Therefore, discussion is no good. A statement of truth taken into your consciousness and worked with, as the Master asked, take it into the sanctuary of your own being. Pray in secret. Pray in secret. Study in secret. Meditate in secret. Cogitate. And let the fruitage of it appear outwardly. Now, don't be a cloud without rain. Don't go around talking truth. One of the most powerful things the Master taught was, don't pray to be seen of men, because though you will get some credit from men, you forfeit the benefit that you will get from God, or would have gotten. So it is with this. You can, if you like, go out to your friends and relatives and tell them all you've learned here this week, and I'm sure that many of them will pat you on the back and say, that's beautiful and that's fine. And so you can pride yourself that you've not only got some knowledge, but now it's been acknowledged. But I don't mind telling you that you will have lost a great deal of what you gained here. You will just have thrown your pearls before swine. What you keep locked up in you until it becomes a very, very part of your consciousness will manifest itself in health or harmony or peace or prosperity. Then when someone comes to you and says, what have you, you're in a position to share it, not only because you know it, but because you are it. You have demonstrated it. And no one can take it from you now, because if all the world said you were wrong, your demonstration of it proves that you are right. Don't forget, you don't benefit the infinite way when you go out and talk about it, or advertise it, or boast about it, or brag. That's no advertisement for the infinite way, and be assured it doesn't need it or want it. You can be a light of the world for your own sake and for the sake of the world, by locking these secrets up inside your own being until they are yours, and until the fruitage of it begins to appear to your friends, and then begin to feed them. The milk of the Word at first. The milk at first. This lesson which you have had in the last half of this tonight has previously been given only to 12 students. So I waited a long, long while before revealing it. And yet I've witnessed it for years. And the only reason for keeping it is not that I wanted a monopoly, not that I wanted to keep it a secret, but because the students hadn't prepared themselves. It was as if they were playing around with kindergarten stuff and then wanting college teaching. But the work of 1959 has prepared our students for this. And I want to make the message complete. And I want to see it demonstrated in its completeness, so that when this day comes, which is being brought nearer by the publishing houses that are sending our books far and wide, and the other recognition that it's gaining, when that day breaks and people say, for heaven's sakes, give us more of this healing, send us teachers, that we'll have them. We won't have them if you can't demonstrate, because there'll be no diplomas and no certificates saying that you're a teacher. The only thing that's going to prove you're a teacher is the ability to heal and teach. There's no authorization from headquarters, for there are no headquarters. Thank you until we meet again.